On our 30th anniversary, he stood up from his chair as if he were announcing a toast, but the words that left Darren Price's mouth landed like a verdict. "I want someone younger," he said, and for a heartbeat the room held its breath. Crystal chiming, laughter caught midair, the band's rhythm faltering. Naomi Sterling felt the phrase hit the back of her teeth like a bitter candy. Around her, gowns swirled and men whooped. A few cameras blinked red. It was meant to be spectacle. It was meant to break her. She did not gasp. She did not weep. She straightened her shoulders the way she had been taught to do in photographs. And in the silence, she tasted something metallic and clear. The end of a lie and the beginning of a line she would follow. Naomi had not always been the kind of woman who expected betrayal from the people she loved. For 30 years, she and Darren had shared routines. Coffee grounds scraped into the bin at dawn, the same chipped mug for his black coffee, the way their jackets assume each other's scent on the back of a chair. They had been photographed together in sunlit kitchens, at book launches, at quiet dinners with friends. She had been a black wife who learned how to navigate whitened rooms and corporate ceilings. She had learned to temper her laugh and to make herself a presence that did not ask permission. These facts are important. Naomi had never been naive. She was careful in ways that came from decades of claiming space where she had to. But the small things had sneaked up on her like hairline cracks. Late-night calls that ended when she entered the kitchen. The faint scent of a perfume that did not belong to her. Calendar entries that read like rehearsed secrets. Call S at 11 a.m. A reminder he thought he had hidden, the digital equivalent of a folded note passed under a classroom desk. She noticed them in the pattern of living. The first night, it was a vibration on Darren's bedside table at midnight. He answered with practiced calm. He spoke low, as if the voice could be made invisible. Naomi lay awake, watching the ceiling fan slice the dark. The next morning, she found a sticky note on the sink, his handwriting, small and tidy. Meeting, confidential. She did not confront him then. She poured cereal, sipped coffee, and put the note in a drawer like one puts away a small animal one cannot mend. Weeks turned months. There were more things. A lipstick smudge on a napkin in the trash. An Airbnb confirmation that appeared in an account they did not share. A few microtransactions and statements. Flowers, the same boutique name repeated in warm, fuzzy charges. Each one taken alone could be explained. Together, they told a different story. Naomi's temperament was not dramatic. She collected evidence the way a gardener collects seeds, methodically, without fanfare, because she understood that roots were what mattered. She did not record conversations. She did not smash windows. She opened the apps on his laptop one slow, ordinary evening while he was in the shower and the radio played something soft. She looked at the browser history, and there it was. Searches for how to stage an amicable divorce announcement, signing away property rights, best public humiliations for a spouse. Her skin went cold. A calendar entry blinked at her with the casual cruelty of a scheduled assault. Call S at 11 a.m. She read it 3 times. And then, spelled out in a string of messages she found when she scrolled through an email thread Darren had left open, a line that made her eyes blur with anger and a peculiar crystalline focus. She won't suspect a thing. The sentence was a decision, not an accident. It was a plan articulated in lowercase, safe from punctuation, but full of cruelty. Naomi did not take the emails into the world like a flag. She photocopied them with quiet hands and made a list of what she needed to know, of people to ask, of documents to find. She called Aisha Cole, her friend from law school who had kept to the edges of corporate litigation and now ran a small practice handling family matters and estates. Naomi did not call in fire, she called in strategy. Aisha, I need to know about premarital property laws in our state. Naomi said, her voice folded into the broom of routine, calm, precise. Is everything all right? Aisha asked, and Naomi, for a moment, heard the woman she had been at 23 when she first loved someone and believed in the possibility of soft answers. No, but I'll be all right, Naomi said. Can we meet tomorrow? Aisha agreed. She came the next morning with a thermos of awful office coffee and a practical, sharp look. Naomi poured the coffee and laid out what she had: bank statements, a copy of the condominium deed, photographs of the sticky note, screenshots of messages. She told Aisha about the calendar entry and finally about the line she had read that cut through her like a blade. Aisha's hands did not shake as they moved over the papers. There are people who become steady in the presence of trouble. Aisha was one of them. You need to confirm the title, she said. If the condo was a gift from your parents and it was titled to you before the marriage, it's premarital property in most cases. That gives you strong protection, but we have to verify. I know someone, Mr. Perry at the title office. He's straightforward. I'll call him. Naomi felt something like a breath unfasten. Protection was a shape she could touch. The idea of going through the motions, contacting people, verifying documents, opening accounts, was not revenge. It was survival dressed in paperwork. Mr. Perry confirmed what Naomi hoped and feared. He read aloud the registry entry to her in a phone line that seemed both clinical and tender. The condo had been a transfer from Naomi's parents to Naomi Sterling, dated 5 months before her wedding, premarital. He offered to provide copies and to notarize anything that might be necessary. Naomi listened, quiet, feeling how a single signature could become the hinge on which years would turn. But documents are only as powerful as the person who knows how to use them. Naomi began to act. She opened a modest bank account in her name only at a branch away from their neighborhood. She gave Aisha limited power to request certain records. She changed passwords. She did not tell Darren. To the world, she smiled at him when he passed through the foyer, the way she had smiled at schools, company dinners, fundraisers. At first, she felt ridiculous, like an actress rehearsing a part she had not requested. But acting, she discovered, can crystallize intention. There was a pleasure in the small, grown-up decisions. Choosing a different checkbook, the delight of taking a pen and signing her full name with no shared "and" in the middle. Each act was an incision of autonomy. It was during this time that the letter arrived from Germany. It was an envelope of strange, precise paper, the kind that seemed to belong to a different century. Naomi had not expected the voice of Aunt Josephine again. The woman had been a stubborn, solitary figure who had left Naomi a peppered trail of letters and a childhood full of stories about the old country, markets with lace, and the cadence of a language that seemed to cling to consonants like jewelry. A legal notice, briefer than Naomi expected, said that Josephine Sterling, who had no children and few close relatives, had left a portion of her estate to Naomi. The amount was substantial enough to matter. It was not monstrous, it was dignified, like a portfolio that finally matched a name. Naomi read the paperwork twice, then called Mr. Perry to ask what exact steps would be needed if she were to accept the funds and transfer them into her separate domestic account. "This will change things," Mr. Perry said simply. It did. The inheritance rendered a practical reality to what had so far been paper and intention. It meant Naomi could hire professionals without hesitation. It meant she could pay for independent counsel, obtain a forensic accountant if necessary, and consider, with options clearer, the full map of her future. Still, money on paper is not a shield in a room full of people who had been cultivated to admire Darren. He had an easy way of inhabiting spaces, the half smile, the practiced interest in other people's businesses, the capacity to make himself the axis of attention. In the weeks before the anniversary, he polished that skill to a schedule. He practiced the words he would use the way a dealer practices a hand. Celeste, his mother, watched with the cultivated expression of a woman who had given a great many opinions over the years. She liked the tidy lines of a marriage that could be explained and rearranged without fuss. Sierra, the young assistant, smiled with a fragility that made Naomi's chest ache in a particular animal way, like the ache of seeing small birds in a storm. Naomi watched them. She learned to read their rhythms, like a neighbor learns the sound of different footsteps on a stairwell. Sierra arrived later to staff meetings, her perfume a bright, sweet thing that seemed deliberately chosen to announce her. Naomi smelled it and did not say anything, because scent is a language that often speaks without witnesses. She made notes, quietly, mentally assembling a case or perhaps a script. Aisha, who had a knack for defanging drama into packets of logic, told Naomi that dignity was found in facts. "We don't need spectacle to beat spectacle," she said over a late dinner. The city spread like a low pulse outside the window. "We just need the right documents and the right story told at the right time." "People will believe what looks convincing," Naomi said, polishing her fork against the cloth napkin like a small ritual. "And Darren has been preparing an audience for months." "Audience or not, truth doesn't need an audience to be truth," Aisha replied. "But sometimes the audience matters for the credibility of witnesses. You asked me to meet you, Naomi. You asked me to do this in a way that preserves your dignity. That's our job." Naomi liked this formulation of dignity because it did not depend on someone forgiving her or applauding her. It depended on law and evidence and the fact that there are certain things you cannot legally conjure away: a title deed, a bank transfer, a notarized document. Preparation can be unglamorous. Naomi sat on the floor of her bedroom at odd hours, spreading out paperwork like a tide pooling around her ankles. She called account managers and asked discreet questions. She made copies. She arranged for a courier to bring certified documents to Aisha's office. She had a list of names who would need to be informed at the right moment: Mr. Perry for titles, Mr. Boudreau, Michael Boudreau, who had been Darren's boss for years, though Naomi had never liked the way the man tilted his head and cataloged people's vulnerabilities as if he were appraising merchandise. If Naomi were to step into a fight over reputation, she could not overlook reputational weapons being brandished against her. She needed allies who would testify to the man she had been and the woman she had become. The nights before the anniversary were precise with their own rituals. Darren rehearsed with an entirely theatrical concern for cadence. He practiced the way he would reveal the truth to those gathered, a show he intended to make tidy, as if humiliation could be packaged and served with hors d'oeuvres. Celeste instructed him on tone and timing. They mapped out the seating plan: who would laugh, who would be embarrassed, who could be expected to blush on cue. The nights before the anniversary were precise with their own rituals. Darren rehearsed with an entirely theatrical concern for cadence. He practiced the way he would reveal the truth to those gathered, a show he intended to make tidy, as if humiliation could be packaged and served with hors d'oeuvres. Celeste instructed him on tone and timing. They mapped out the seating plan: who would laugh, who would be embarrassed, who could be expected to blush on cue. Naomi listened to the house creak around their lives and imagined instead the faces of people she loved and the ways their expressions would shift if truth entered the room on her terms. She did not tell Darren she knew. Instead, she refined her own rehearsal. She chose a dress that made her feel like herself: black, simple, unadorned, not an armor, but also not pleading. She wanted nothing that could be mistaken for an apology. In the mirror, she practiced standing still, letting expressions pass through like weather. She whispered lines to herself, short, plain things, not speeches. "I know," she said, "I have documents." The words felt like the hinge of a door. The perfumed scent of Sierra became almost its own character in the house. Naomi would pass Darren in the hallway and feel that note of citrus and jasmine that did not belong to any of the perfumes she kept on her dressing table. She would fold her hands and turn her face because she had learned that confrontation, raw and loud, made better copy than it did change. There is a particular kind of pain that comes from watching people plan cruelty and believing they have foreknowledge of your weakness. Naomi turned that pain into a list of actions. She hired a forensic accountant to trace the flow of funds that had been quietly rerouted: flowers, reserved dining rooms, payments that tied back to accounts they had shared. The accountant, an unflashy man with steady fingers, found the threads she suspected: funds indirectly supporting a narrative, payments that made the evening possible. They were not enormous sums on the scale of global finance, but they were evidence that the plan was funded. She also discovered something else. In pursuit of their scheme, Darren and Mr. Hayes, the small-time lawyer Darren had been flirting with for favors, had begun to shuffle paperwork they'd hoped no one would notice. An expense report showed payments to a boutique that matched Sierra's perfume charges. A catering invoice revealed an extra line item that read almost like a stage direction: special announcement setup. It was all the more damning for its ordinariness. It showed a hope that ordinary people would not look too closely at the components of a plan. Naomi sat with those invoices and thought about the band playing at the anniversary. Their music, the way applause would be weaponized. She thought about the faces who would be present: colleagues whose promotions had been greased by Darren's charm, neighbors who had invited them to every barbecue. She thought about the mother who stood at the head of his family and nodded as if to a liturgy she had rehearsed since childhood. Yet despite the planning, Naomi felt neither revenge nor glee. Her motive was a slender, stubborn thing: to defend the life she had built, to claim her name and her space. In private, she thought of her mother, of a woman who had taught her to keep receipts and to trust only documents when emotions made people messy. That lesson had been practical, not cold. It was about surviving without losing one's dignity. Because dignity mattered, Naomi made her moves with a quiet theatricality of her own. She arranged for a photographer she trusted to be present that evening, but not for the reasons Darren expected. The photographer was briefed to document an ordinary celebration, to capture candor, to be ready, if asked, to corroborate where Naomi stood and what she did. She told him simply, "Take everything as it is." Aisha suggested timing. "You should speak at some point," she said, "but not like you are defending yourself, like you are clarifying facts. People respond to facts." "I won't be dramatic," Naomi answered. "I'll be brief. I don't want to be cruel." Aisha's face softened. "Good. Let them come to their own judgments." On the morning of the anniversary, Naomi woke early to a city simmering with heat. She opened her blinds and watched light spill into the street. Workers loading in decorations, a florist's van double-parked, men in uniforms making last-minute adjustments. It felt like the world preparing for a sermon it had not asked for. She brewed tea and sat with the envelope from Germany on her lap. She called Mr. Perry to confirm a copy of the title would be delivered that afternoon to Aisha's office, and he promised. There were small acknowledgments that day: messages from friends, the soft press of hands. Her sister left a voicemail that made Naomi smile and then cry, because the warmth in that voice was not theatrical and had not been practiced. Naomi kept it in her pocket like an amulet. At noon, a calendar notification popped up on her phone. An old club invite she had set months ago flashed like a ghost and then dissolved. For a moment, she felt the ancient temptation to cancel everything, to disappear. But disappearance is not a strategy. It is a surrender. Naomi stood and dressed, feeling the fabric settle, and told herself that some things required a presence that was unafraid to be seen. If anyone had asked Naomi what kind of person she wanted to be in that room, accuser, victim, matriarch, she could not have answered directly. She had only an image in mind. A woman who controls her own narrative because she refuses to have it written by others. The title Black Wife, which others had sometimes used as shorthand and which Naomi had reclaimed as a quiet proudness, felt like a worn coat she could choose to wear or to discard. That day she wore it like a certainty. It was not a flag of grievance. It was an affirmation that she belonged everywhere she chose to belong. A note came across from Darren around mid-afternoon, innocuous and cheerful. Looking forward to tonight, it said, accompanied by an emoji he used when he wanted to convey ease. Naomi put the phone down and imagined him smoothing his cufflinks while rehearsing the words that would slice. She did not respond. That afternoon, she and Aisha met with Mr. Perry. Perry in a small office whose windows looked onto a row of townhouses. He presented the notarized documents with a ceremonious, almost apologetic air. To him, deeds were not weapons, they were public records. Naomi took the copy and felt the paper like a talisman. He explained in plain terms what the registry entry meant, that the condominium was a premarital asset and that under state law it was hers and hers alone unless she chose a different arrangement. He also pointed to a small but crucial clause about how marital funds expended on improvements could be accounted for, an issue that Aisha and the accountant would explore later. For now, the paper did exactly what Naomi needed. It made her claim visible and incontrovertible. That evening, Naomi sat at her dressing table and let the house around her cool into a respectful hush. She opened the envelope from Germany again, this time looking at the account information with practical eyes. She instructed the bank to transfer the funds into the newly opened account and had the confirmation printed. The money itself was not a victory lap. It was a resource, a set of options that allowed her to act without begging or bargaining. She packed a small bag for the night, simple essentials, copies of the documents tucked into a folder, the confirmation of the title deed, a printed correspondence from the accountant detailing suspicious payments. She placed the folder into the bag like someone placing tools by the door before a long trip. It was not theatrical. It was restraint with sharp edges. As she was leaving, Naomi paused by the mirror and adjusted a single earring. Her reflection looked like a woman who had been through weather and had learned to read sky. She sent a quick text to Aisha, in the pocket. "Be ready." Aisha replied with a single word, "Ready." The drive to the venue felt like a slow film of neighborhoods she had once loved. She watched the city blur and thought of the life she had shared with Darren, the lighter moments that belonged to both of them and the heavier ones that had been handled with polite neglect. She thought about the ways people can be convincingly cruel while believing themselves justified. She thought about the phrase she had found, the little sentence that had made everything upend. "She won't suspect a thing." It was a sentence meant to erase the other person's agency. Naomi now knew that agency was not a commodity to be withheld, it was replicable. Outside the venue, black limousines and valet attendants created a soft chaos. Guests stepped out in gowns and suits that seemed to glitter more brightly under his smile. Naomi felt the evening press on her like an audience leaning in. She took a breath and stepped from the car. The foyer smelled of lilies and something else, fragrance that felt like a promise. Naomi moved through pockets of conversation, the murmur of old acquaintances making small talk, the hum of phones already posting images of candlelight and preparations. Sierra was there, looking slightly too young for such a role, her perfume a bright, calculated note that seemed to try to claim space on purpose. Celeste stood by, her face a composed map. Darren, when Naomi saw him, had that practiced look of man who assumed favor as a right. He kissed her cheek in an exaggerated way that was meant to suggest reconciliation. Cameras blinked. Friends smiled. In that instant, someone handed Naomi a champagne flute, as if to toast a narrative that had been rehearsed since the guests received their invitations. She felt the familiar shift inside her, a calm that is not peace but preparation. Her friends thronged around as she was led to a table. The band played softly in the background. People clinked glasses and told stories about the couple, as if history were a tidy bibliography of small, curated moments. Somewhere in the room, Darren's voice rose with a practiced warmth. He stood, and the room obliged him with attention. He said the sort of things a man says when he wants to be remembered as generous and decisive. Compliments, a few jokes, the kind of recollections that were polished for the people who liked polished things. He steered the conversation with the surety of someone who had rehearsed his lines. Naomi watched him, thinking of the 1,000 small infractions that had led here and the 1,000 larger ones that had been disguised in charm. Then the moment came when he reached for the microphone. Heads turned. Someone tapped their phone to record. Naomi felt the room tilt, as if it were waiting for a verdict. She kept her hands folded in her lap. She let the moment swell like a tide that would reveal what had been under the surface for 30 years. If you like true-life turnaround stories, subscribe for more. The sentence landed not as an interruption, but as a small, honest nudge. It was not Naomi's behavior. It was the narrator making the production live. A light, necessary prompt to the audience to stay. The band softened, and the room, for one instant, held its collective breath. Darren smiled, and his smile was a practiced thing, an instrument. He made his announcement in the clipped, formal cadence of someone who wants humiliation to be tidy. He spoke of needing space, of incompatibility dressed up as virtue, of wanting someone younger. Around Naomi, at the nearby tables, there were murmurs like birds startled from a hedge. Invitations rustled. A few guests stifled gasps. A total of 30 years of marriage was reduced into a phrase and a plan. The first ripples of reaction swept the room as if a wind had moved through a field. Naomi felt each one, moved by them and through them. She folded her hands and reached inside the bag she had brought, fingers finding the folder with the documents and the printed bank transfers. Her pulse hummed under the skin in a steady, consistent note. She rose, not dramatically, not to challenge, but to present, and crossed the room toward the lectern with the measured deliberation of someone who had been taught how to carry themselves in rooms where histories are made and unmade. The microphone was warm under her palm. She touched it as if she were touching a thin, familiar thing, an instrument, not a weapon. She spoke. "Good evening," Naomi said. Her voice was quiet and even. "I want to thank everyone for being here." The moment balanced on a thin edge between the ordinary and the extraordinary. In the silence after she spoke, people noticed small things, the way she kept her back straight, the way her hands did not tremble. Someone nearby whispered that Naomi always had an actor's sense for the right cadence. Others simply watched, because when a woman who has been sidelined decides to speak, the room must incline to listen. She did not scream. She did not beg. She laid out facts, short, precise sentences like pebbles placed with intent. She said that the condominium was titled solely in her name before she and Darren had married. She said that she had documentation of funds being used to prepare the evening, public records of transactions that had been routed through accounts associated with the people planning the humiliation. She said she had received a legal notice from Germany confirming that an aunt had left a bequest to her. She did not use the language of accusation. She used the language of paperwork. Around the room, the air shifted. Conversations broke into smaller currents. Cameras rustled. Darren's face, which had been set like a mask, began to fracture. Celeste's expression lost its composed sheen. There was a sound then, soft at first, the shuffling of people reorienting themselves in the presence of new information. The band had stopped playing. Someone near the back murmured, partly in disbelief and partly in the need to narrate the moment for another. Naomi's voice did not rush. She finished by saying simply, "I am not asking for anything that isn't mine." No one laughed. Naomi could have stopped then. She could have left things to unfold. But there was a certain necessity in being thorough. She had rehearsed in her mind what to say next, a promise to submit documents to Aisha and to the relevant parties, an offer to let the record show what had been presented. She had decided earlier that she would not humiliate with speculation or dramatic invective. She believed in facts, and she believed that facts were enough. She handed the folder to Aisha at the front table. Aisha accepted it with a nod. The photographer, who had been taking unobtrusive images, shot one final frame of Naomi standing by the lectern, her profile silvered by the overhead light. Outside, in the bright dressing rooms and the alleyways, texts began to explode. Social media, ever a hungry thing, started to wake up. People who had been sipping wine snapped photos and uploaded them, the pixels making a new kind of witness. The evening's carefully curated narrative was now a conversation with a life of its own. Naomi did not gloat. She breathed and felt the room move around her like a tide, some waves supporting her and others crashing against the shore she had claimed. She had spoken, she had offered proof. Whatever came next would be outside her control. But control had never been the point. The point had been to refuse to be the subject of someone else's story. At that moment, as she stepped down from the lectern and rejoined the group around her table, Naomi felt something loosen in her chest. It was not relief. It was not a victory yet. It was the first small clearing after a long storm. She sat, and the chatter around her had the quick, panicked cadence of people trying to reconcile what they believed with what they had just seen. The night did not end like a play. It ended with ambulatory conversations and the sense that a new story had been written into the lives of everyone present. Naomi rode home later with the city lights sliding past. Her phone buzzed with messages, some supportive, some stunned, some cruel. She read a few and then set the device aside. There were matters to address, legal filings, a formal complaint, and a need to document the evening in a way that could be presented in court if necessary. She slept, though rest was thin. She dreamed of documents and doors, of lighter things, afternoons with her aunt on warm days, the smell of cinnamon and old books. When dawn came, Naomi rose and found that her world had already begun to change. News cycles had picked up the story. A friend texted a link to an article with images from the evening. Comments had already taken on their own life. Naomi made a list the way she always had. She notified Aisha that she was ready to proceed with formal action if needed. She arranged for certified copies of the deed and the inheritance letters to be lodged with the proper parties. She attended to the practicalities of securing accounts, placing hold requests on certain lines of credit that could be used to argue against the premarital claim. She prepared herself for the small bureaucratic battles that would follow silence and spectacle. People reacted predictably. Some took Naomi's side immediately. Others remained loyal to Darren in the way that loyalty often hinges on long histories and convenience. But among the flux, there were real, palpable changes. Mr. Boudreau, Darren's boss, received messages from his HR department, an uneasy administrative kind of pressure that suggested reputational consequences. Colleagues who had once laughed at Darren's jokes began to distance themselves. Mr. Hayes, the small lawyer who had been so complicit in the plan, called, his voice slippery. Naomi did not take the call. The weeks that followed were not clean. Legal processes moved with the measured patience of institutions. A formal petition for dissolution would be filed. There would be hearings, exchanges of documents, and the inevitable parsing of marital and premarital assets. Aisha advised specifics: file this, request that. The accountant would need every transaction detail. Subpoenas might be necessary. Naomi listened and complied. She lived through forms and affidavits with the same stoicism she had applied to other crises in life. But the public moment had already done something profound. The perception of Darren had shifted like weather around a mountain. Where he had once been a man who could command attention with an easy laugh, he now found people measuring their words. Sierra, whose faith had once been wet with tentative rejoicing at new attention, now avoided Naomi in the street as if the world had given her a different passport. Celeste called Naomi once with a clipped politeness that tried to float above confrontation. Naomi answered with a curt kindness that closed the line. The legal path would take months. The immediate ripples, however, had consequences that shaped the next act of their lives. Offers for Darren's speaking engagements were deferred. Clients in his firm made oblique references to focusing on internal strategy. Words had weight, and in a world that adores spectacle, the right paper can become truth. Naomi continued to file, to sign, to present. She moved forward with the daily, unromantic work that would make her case airtight. One quiet afternoon, as she sat in Aisha's office with a stack of certified documents in neat piles, Naomi opened a window and let sunlight spill into the room. She watched dust swirl and thought about the strange trajectories lives take. She had not sought to be hero or villain. She had sought to be clear-minded and to protect herself. In the years of their marriage, Naomi had learned an economy of feeling, to invest emotion where it mattered and to withdraw where it did not. That patience had been invaluable now. It allowed her to navigate the small bureaucracies of justice without losing sight of what she wanted, a life dignified and unencumbered by someone else's manipulation. The case would proceed. Friends and strangers would have opinions. Social media would build a myth of it all. But for Naomi, the work was mundane and exacting, making copies, verifying signatures, ensuring that every paper could be placed in a court of law and held up without flinching. A month after the anniversary, Naomi received a formal notice that a hearing had been set to determine certain temporary arrangements. The court calendar felt like a different kind of stage, one where costumes are replaced by legal coats and the narratives must be constructed from evidence, not gossip. She met with Aisha in the courthouse cafeteria to review the binder that would accompany their argument. The deed, the bank statements, the email threads, the invoices, the formal transfer from Germany. The binder was a small thing, heavy with possibility. Naomi felt its weight and, for the first time in many months, allowed herself a small private smile. "Whatever happens," Aisha said, pushing the binder toward Naomi like a compact island in a sea of uncertainty, "we have the goods." Naomi did not feel arrogant. She felt simply equipped. She had been given means and had used them with a kind of careful artistry. She thought of Aunt Josephine and the quiet rooms of her childhood in which decisions were made without fanfare. Outside the courthouse, while leaving for the day, Naomi passed a newsstand where a tabloid had taken an angle that attempted to turn her into sensationalism. She looked at the headline and felt the old coldness, the old risk of being reduced to a phrase. She thought, briefly, about whether the world preferred tidy narratives. Betrayed wife, predatory man, vengeance served up as entertainment. She had no desire to feed that hunger. She wanted to be known for what she had done, not for how it would make people clap. That night she packed a small duffel. There were practical reasons. She had arranged to stay at a friend's apartment nearer to the courthouse to minimize drive time and to keep things efficient. But there was also a deeper motive. After 30 years in a marriage that had become a performance for others, she wanted the option to wake up in a room that belonged solely to her for a few days. As she zipped the bag, a message came through from an unfamiliar number. A short note from someone claiming to be a childhood friend of Aunt Josephine's embassy contact, offering condolences and a caution that certain people would be trying to complicate the transfer of funds. Naomi read the message, then forwarded it to Aisha. They were not naive about obstacles. Money and power create incentives for those ready to scramble for advantage. That, too, would be part of the work. In the small hours of the night, long after the city had dimmed and the rest of the household had softened into sleep, Naomi sat at the kitchen table and wrote a short letter to herself. It was not a long document. It did not need to be. She wrote, "I will keep my dignity. I will keep my name. I will move forward." Then she folded the paper and placed it in the front pocket of her duffel. It was an old habit. Write things down, keep them close. In the quiet that followed, as the household breathed and the clock marked time with patient ticks, Naomi allowed herself a small, private sense of readiness. She was not yet finished. The path ahead had hearings and public scrutiny and the possibility of slights that would land like drops of cold rain. There would be days of frustration and nights of small victories. There would be moments when people surprised her with kindness and moments when she had to brace against cold indifference. But she had, in a few quiet months, regained the most important things: evidence, independence, and perhaps most importantly, a sense of the shape of what she wanted next. The night of the anniversary had cracked things open. What remained would be the unglamorous work of law and accounting and human patience. Naomi had placed each document into a folder, each folder into a binder, each binder into a briefcase. She had rehearsed nothing more than the truth. She had not decided to be cruel. She had decided to be unafraid. And so she left, her bag at her shoulder, the city dim behind her. The road ahead was not yet clear, but she had built a bridge of paper and quiet decisions. It would have to be enough for now. The days after the anniversary were noisy in the way of things that must be said aloud to exist. Phones rang, messages multiplied, reporters dug for angles that would turn private injury into a story with a beginning, middle, and a headline. Naomi moved through it with the same methodical steadiness she had brought to her paperwork. She answered the calls that needed answering and let everything else hang in the air until Aisha told her it was time to act. Darren, who had expected applause for his performance, found only shifting faces and a tightening of alliances. Mr. Boudreau, who had once smiled at Darren's anecdotes and placed him on panels, received a terse note from HR and an even more terse call from a client. The corporate world, which had fed on charm and small errors rebranded as boldness, recoiled when the optics changed from curated charisma to documented complicity. Offers were rescinded, invitations evaporated. A company that judged reputational risk as seriously as deficit accounting began a slow, formal distancing. Mr. Hayes, the little lawyer who had trafficked in favors and short-term solutions, did not endure the glare. At first, he called Naomi's number in a voice that slithered between apology and excuse. Naomi let it go to voicemail. The next time he called, Aisha answered with a tone that asked the questions lawyers always ask. Who are you representing, and can your communications be placed on the record? Hayes's answers grew shorter as the days passed. His office sent a single typed note claiming a scheduling conflict. Then his phone went dark. People later said they had seen him on a late flight, a bag slung over one shoulder, and his expression that of a man who realized the audience had turned on him. He left without ceremony. He left behind a string of bounced checks and an inbox the size of a small scandal. In the swirl of public reaction, Naomi anchored herself to the work that would matter in court. There were motions to file, affidavits to prepare, and the forensic accountant's notes to be scrutinized. The accountant, an unflashy woman with the kind of face that looked like it had learned to measure things carefully, laid out transactions in a way that looked, at first glance, boring. When she explained them, however, they took on the clarity of a map. payments routed through intermediary accounts, purchases that matched the boutique charges, invoices for special announcement setup, and floral orders that aligned with the days the conspirators had booked rehearsal dinners. The money trail was not theatrical, it was pedestrian and therefore convincing. Evidence that hides in the ordinary is often the most damning. Discovery became a measured war. Requests flew to banks, subpoenas went to event planners, the boutique that sold the perfume was asked to produce receipts. Aisha handled each request like a surgeon, precise, unemotional, efficient. Naomi sat with stacks of certified copies and watched the story of her life reappear as documents. The deed with her maiden name, receipts with account numbers, a transfer from a German account bearing the formal stamp of a foreign registrar. Each paper, when placed in sequence, argued its own case. The public had its say too. Social media swelled with commentary. There were opinion pieces that sought to frame Naomi as a cautionary tale and others that applauded her composure. People who had once casually referenced Darren's charm now asked why they had missed the signs. Mr. Boudreaux's office responded to press inquiries with a statement about ongoing personnel matters. Darren's calendar filled with cancellations. He called Naomi once, voice pitched somewhere between fury and supplication. She did not pick up, preferring Aisha's counsel to his improvisations. As the months moved, the legal process settled into the quiet rhythms of motion practice, mediations that went nowhere, interrogatories answered with the careful avoidance of those who believe truth is negotiable. The judge assigned to their case was neither theatrical nor cruel. She was the kind of jurist who let evidence do the work of persuasion. The hearing to determine provisional measures came first, and Naomi prepared for it the way she prepared for any work that required her competence, with care and with little vanity. On the morning of the first hearing, Naomi dressed simply, blouse, neat skirt, the same black coat she had worn the night of the anniversary, to project an idea of herself that required no explanation. The courthouse smelled like old paper and the faint metallic tang of distant bureaucracy. People in suits passed with their own small dramas tucked under their arms. There were cameras in the lobby waiting for the spectacle of litigants and their lawyers, but once inside the courtroom, the cameras were buffered by the solemnity of procedure. Here, her life would be measured not by the quantity of astonishment it produced, but by the clarity of its record. Aisha was surgical in the presentation. She did not raise her voice. She let the documents she had spent weeks assembling speak. The forensic accountant walked the court through transactions with the steady cadence of someone who knew how to translate numbers into narrative. She pointed to dates, to routing numbers, to invoices that matched the timeline of the planned announcement. Mr. Perry's certified copy of the deed was introduced without fanfare. The registry entry, with its timestamp, performed what no rhetoric could. It made Naomi's claim visible and official. Darren took the stand reluctantly. He was more defensive than dramatic. Public fury had taught him to recoil in ways that made his sentences smaller, less polished. In cross-examination, his answers were a series of evasions. He insisted, as men who think charm is character will insist, that he had meant no harm, that the evening was supposed to be an honest conversation about a marriage. Aisha did what Aisha always did. She asked questions that forced simple answers and then let the paperwork confirm them. Celeste sat in the audience with a face like an unglazed plate. She testified to a certain family history, how marriages could be rearranged with minimal scandal, how families sometimes decided practical things in private. But her testimony had the staccato of someone uncomfortable with scrutiny. Under direct questioning by Naomi's counsel, she began to hedge. There is a difference between the theory of small arrangements and the reality of documents that show payments and orders placed without the full consent of both parties. The record eventually forced Celeste to choose between loyalty and truth. She chose the latter, but without enthusiasm. In that choice, she lost performative certainty and gained the sort of embarrassment that settles into the shoulders and slowly changes posture. Mr. Boudreau was called as a witness for the defense, at least initially. Darren's team hoped to show that his professional life was separate from the domestic. Put on the stand, Boudreau displayed the corporate politeness of a man trained to protect company interests, not to absolve personal conduct. His answers were cautious. He would not, in a courtroom, risk the corporate equilibrium to rescue a former star. When asked about Darren's reputation, he spoke of standards and internal policy and a need for impartial investigation. It was not a rescue. For the defense, it felt like losing a set piece. As the hearings accumulated, Mr. Hayes's absence became a more complicated problem for Darren. He could not produce the lawyer who allegedly advised him on forms of public disclosure, on the routing of funds, or on how to stage an amicable separation. The little lawyer's disappearance became a practical hurdle. Documents he should have had, emails he should have sent, records that his presence might have explained, all were missing. Naomi's team filed motions to compel communications, and the court flagged the absence as problematic. When, months later, it emerged that Hayes had left the state and was avoiding service, his maneuvering looked less like strategy and more like abandonment. The plaintiff's case, though understated, began to gather momentum. The combination of a legally certified title, the accountant's trail, and the narrative established in the public hearing created a coherent picture. The judge's questions were precise and practical. Had marital funds been used to improve premarital property, and if so, how should equitable reimbursement be handled? Naomi's counsel conceded that where marital funds had been used for improvements, there could be accounting for value added, nothing theatrical, simply the math of contribution. Aisha and the accountant presented a reasonable method for reconciliation: quantify the value of improvements and adjust accordingly. The court accepted that approach as fair. The final hearing, set months after the anniversary, resembled, in tone, the slow folding of a large map. Each itinerary of claimed facts was smoothed and examined. The judge, deliberate and careful, weighed the certified deed against the flow of funds and the testimony that had been given. When she made her decisions, they were not the flourish of revenge nor the product of sentiment. They were legal determinations focused on property, liability, and the structure of the marriage. Her findings were clear. The condominium was confirmed as premarital property, titled to Naomi before the marriage. Thus, it remained Naomi's. The court assigned liability for the funds expended to stage the public humiliation and for certain debts related to the event to Darren, finding that those expenditures were not legitimate household expenses, but were part of a private scheme orchestrated without Naomi's consent. The marriage was dissolved. With no minor children and with an accounting that recognized premarital holdings and equitable considerations for improvements, the judgment did not order long-term alimony. Naomi was granted legal possession of the condominium and awarded the costs of certain proceedings. There was no triumphalism in the language of the order, only the dry, clear logic of findings and remedies. Darren's professional life continued its slide. Clients who had once tolerated risk for the sake of his charm began to leave. Invitations to speak and consult dwindled until he faced the practical reality that reputation, once fractured, is difficult to stitch back into place. He took a leave from his post. There were, in the weeks after the judgment, terse statements about focusing on personal matters. The public, always hungry for a neat ending, chewed the story into the small talk of cocktail parties and the commentary of late-night panels. His mother, Celeste, retreated into a quieter existence, marked by fewer calls and a more careful approach to sharing opinions. The little lawyer, Mr. Hayes, was formally sanctioned in small ways. His name lingered like a bad footnote in the filings. Sierra, who had borne the brunt of public curiosity, vanished from the social feeds that had once showcased her tentative ascent. She made a public apology of a modest tone, acknowledging the harm caused by being complicit and admitting a lapse in judgment. There was, in the weeks that followed, an attempt at restitution, quiet contacts with charities and small volunteer positions, but there were also the practical consequences of reputational damage. She took a job that paid less and asked fewer questions. The narrative arc that had once seemed so bright for her dimmed into ordinary life, work, learning, and the private effort to become a person whose mistakes did not define her forever. There were costs to Naomi as well. Legal victories require stamina, and the months of hearings left marks that were not erased by the judge's signature. There were late nights, moments of fatigue, the daily grind of translating paper into proof. But she had, at the end of the process, something many people never have: a clear legal separation and a financial footing that allowed choices. The inheritance from Aunt Josephine, placed prudently and used judiciously, paid legal bills and left enough to seed the project Naomi had been contemplating for years, a small publishing venture that would let her curate books by writers whose voices she believed had been overlooked. She moved to Miami the way a person moves when they are intentionally making a life change, with boxes labeled by room, lists of utilities to transfer, and the careful placement of a single photograph on a shelf. Her new apartment had windows that took the city's bright light and let it spill across a small desk. She rented a modest office near a neighborhood that smelled of roasted coffee and the sea. In the mornings, she drank fresh espresso and read submissions, the kind of work that suited her mind, the slow, exacting business of words. Launching the editorial project was less glamorous than people assumed. She negotiated leases, hired a small staff, a young editor who loved poetry, an operations manager who loved spreadsheets, and built a list of titles that mattered to her: memoirs that told of ordinary courage, essays that examined identity without spectacle, novels that refused easy answers. The business moved at the pace of careful decisions, rights agreements, modest advances, a design sensibility that favored warmth and quiet craft. Naomi loved the meetings where covers were chosen and the hum of proofreaders working through late pages. It felt, finally, like work that was hers by choice. The public, predictably, had an appetite for the outcome of her life. There were pieces about the publishing house that focused on the dramatic past and less on the books themselves. Naomi learned to let the latter speak for the work she was building. The office window framed palms and the occasional cargo plane, like a reminder that life moves on in larger arcs. She built routines: a midday walk on the beach, a weekly call with Aisha, visits with friends who had stood by her. She kept a small ritual of lighting a candle on the first morning of each book launch, a quiet act of gratitude to the people whose words she shepherded into the world. People asked if she felt vindictive. A younger reporter once posed the question in a way that assumed bitterness must be the natural residue of such a public break. Naomi answered, as she always did, with a short, honest sentence. "I don't seek revenge," she said. "I defended my life." The sentence was not rhetorical flourish. It was a practice. She spent time thinking about what defense looked like: clarity about property, tenacity about documentation, the courage to be seen speaking calmly in a room loud with expectation. In the quiet of her office, with books stacked and a kettle hissing, she felt the truth of the words as practical and necessary rather than performative. One morning, months after the court's decision and after the publishing house had released its first modest list of titles, Naomi received a letter from a small bookstore owner in the Midwest. Inside, handwritten on lined paper, were a few lines about how the books had found a place in a small town that prided itself on listening. She read the note twice and then pinned it to a corkboard behind her desk. Small gestures like that, an unread manuscript that found a reader, a letter from someone who felt less alone, were the sorts of returns she had always valued more than applause. The world did not tidy itself in neat conclusions. Darren found quieter work. He lived in a different kind of public now, one that required fewer stage props and more, perhaps, of the kind of reckoning people rarely accept. Mr. Hayes's career never fully recovered. Small practices that build on reputation are fragile, and reputation is, as Naomi had come to see, both currency and scaffolding. Sierra rebuilt slowly. Celeste, who had once seemed so certain of the architecture of family, aged into the kind of humility that does not demand headlines. Naomi occasionally visited the places in the city that had once held the contours of her life with Darren, the cafe where they had once shared a table, the bench by the river where they had once read in companionable silence. Those visits were not pilgrimages. They were ordinary returns. She sat sometimes with a notebook and sometimes with nothing at all, letting memory be what it is, a layering of small things that remain useful precisely because they are not always spectacular. At night, in her Miami apartment, Naomi kept a small stack of letters from Aunt Josephine in a drawer. When she thought of legacy, she thought not of sudden fortune, but of accumulated choices. The woman who wrote letters from another country, the mother who taught Naomi to keep receipts, the friends who had shown up when it mattered. Those choices created a ledger, a kind of inheritance that was not only monetary. When asked about the title that had become part of the public conversation, Black Wife, Naomi would smile with the mixture of calm and patience she had come to own. The phrase had been used by some as shorthand. She reclaimed it as a quiet affirmation. It signified a history and a presence, not a stereotype. She wore the phrase like a coat, practical, sometimes warming, always hers to put on or take off. The identity had not authored the conflict. It had simply been part of the woman who chose to protect her life. Years later, in a sunlit office lined with books whose pages she had helped bring into being, Naomi would sometimes tell young authors a version of what she had learned. It was not legal advice nor moralizing. It was a set of practical truths she had learned the hard way. Keep documents, trust steady friends, and treat dignity as something you defend with ordinary, precise acts. She would say, simply, that being dignified is a collection of small decisions, not a grand performance. The final scene of the arc that had started with a phrase meant to wound, the phrase, "I want someone younger," was not a single performative moment. It was a life that moved forward in the accumulation of small mornings, of contracts signed in modest conference rooms, of a team that turned manuscripts into books. Naomi's victory was not spectacle. It was a rearrangement of her life into a shape she chose. On a clear afternoon, with the Atlantic light spilling across her desk and the sound of distant traffic like a low tide, Naomi closed the cover of a manuscript she had been editing. She set it down, rubbed her hands together, and looked out the window. There was a steadiness in her breath that had not been there 3 years before. She thought of the folder she had carried the night of the anniversary, the small stack of notarized papers, and the way a certain sentence, "She won't suspect a thing," had once been a plan of erasure. She had countered that plan, not with spectacle, but with facts. "I don't seek revenge," she thought, and then aloud she said the line she had said many times to reporters and friends. "I just defended my life." If this story resonated with you, tell me where you're watching from and what part surprised you the most. If you want to hear more stories about people who turn difficult moments into new beginnings, subscribe and join me for the next one.